What we indicate ontologically with the term attunement is ontically what is most familiar and an everyday kind of thing: mood, being in a mood. Prior to all psychology of moods, a field which, moreover, still lies fallow, we must see this phenomenon as a fundamental existential and outline its structure. Both the undisturbed equanimity and the inhibited discontent of everyday heedfulness, the way we slide over from one to another or slip into bad moods, are by no means nothing ontologically, although these phenomena remain unnoticed as what is supposedly the most indifferent and fleeting in Da-sein. The fact that moods can be spoiled and change only means that Da-sein is always already in a mood. The often persistent, smooth, and pallid lack of mood, which must not be confused with a bad mood, is far from being nothing. Rather, in this, Da-sein becomes tired of itself. The being of the there has, in such a bad mood, becomes manifest as a burden one does not know why. And Da-sein cannot know why because the possibilities of disclosure belonging to cognition fall far short of the primordial disclosure of moods in which Da-sein is brought before its being as the there. Furthermore, an elevated mood can alleviate the manifest burden of being. But the possibility of this mood, too, discloses the burdensome character of Da-sein even when it alleviates that burden. Mood makes manifest how one is and is coming along. In this, how one is, being in a mood brings being to its there. In being in a mood, Da-sein is always already disclosed in accordance with its mood, as that being to which Da-sein was delivered over in its being as the being which it, existing, has to be. To be disclosed does not as such mean to be known. And even in the most indifferent and harmless everydayness, the being of Da-sein can burst forth as the naked, that it is and has to be. The pure that it is shows itself, the whence and whither remain obscure. The fact that Da-sein normally does not give in to such everyday moods, that is, does not pursue what they disclose and does not allow itself to confront what has been disclosed, is no evidence against the phenomenal fact of the mood-like disclosure of the being of the there in its that, but is rather evidence for it. For the most part, Da-sein evades the being that is disclosed in moods in an ontic and existential way. Ontologically and existentially, this means that, even in that to which such a mood pays no attention, Da-sein is unveiled in its being delivered over to the there. In the evasion itself, the there is something disclosed. We shall call this character of being of Da-sein which is veiled in its whence and whither, but in itself all the more openly disclosed, this, that it is, the thrownness Juerfenheit of this being into its there. It is thrown in such a way that it is the there as being in the world. The expression thrownness is meant to suggest the facticity of its being delivered over Überantwortung. That it is and has to be, disclosed in the attunement of Da-sein is not the that, which expresses ontologically and categorially the factuality belonging to objective presence. The latter is accessible only when we ascertain it by looking at it. Rather, the that disclosed in attunement must be understood as an existential attribute of that being which is in the mode of being in the world. Facticity is not the factuality of the factum brutum of something objectively present, but is a characteristic of the being of Da-sein taken on in existence, although initially thrust aside. That of facticity is never to be found by looking. Beings of the character of Da-sein are there in such a way that they find themselves in their thrownness, whether explicitly or not. In attunement, Da-sein is always already brought before itself. It has always already found itself, not as perceiving oneself to be there, but as one finds oneself in attunement. As a being which is delivered over to its being, it is also delivered over to the fact that it must always already have found itself in a finding which comes not from a direct seeking, but from a fleeing. Mood does not disclose in the mode of looking at thrownness, but as turning toward and away from it. For the most part, mood does not turn itself toward the burdensome character of Da-sein manifest in it. It does this least of all in an elevated mood in which this burden is lifted. This turning away is always what it is in the mode of attunement. Phenomenally, what mood discloses and how it discloses would be completely misunderstood if what has been disclosed were conflated with that which attuned Da-sein, at the same time, is acquainted with, knows, and believes. Even when Da-sein is sure of its whither, in faith, or thinks it knows about its whence in rational enlightenment, all of this makes no difference in the face of the phenomenal fact that moods bring Da-sein before the that of its there, which stares directly at it with the inexorability of an enigma. Existentially and ontologically, there is not the slightest justification for minimizing the evidence of attunement by measuring it against the apodictic certainty of the theoretical cognition of something merely objectively present. But the falsification of the phenomena, which banishes them to the sanctuary of the irrational, is no better. Irrationalism, as the counterpart of rationalism, talks about the things to which rationalism is blind, but only with a squint. That a Da-sein factically can, should, and must master its mood with knowledge, and may signify a priority of willing and cognition in certain possibilities of existing. But that must not mislead us into ontologically denying mood as a primordial kind of being of Da-sein in which it is disclosed to itself before all cognition and willing, and beyond their scope of disclosure. Moreover, we never master a mood by being free of a mood, but always through a counter-mood. The first essential ontological characteristic of attunement is, attunement discloses Da-sein in its thrownness, and, initially and for the most part, in the mode of an evasive turning away. From this, we can already see that attunement is far removed from anything like finding a psychical condition. Far from having the character of an apprehension which first turns itself around and then turns back, all immanent reflection can find experiences, only because the there is already disclosed in attunement. Mere mood discloses the there more primordially, but it also closes it off more stubbornly than any not perceiving. Bad moods versed among show this. In bad moods, Da-sein becomes blind to itself, the surrounding world of heedfulness is veiled, the circumspection of taking care is led astray. Attunement is so far from being reflected upon that, in the unreflected devotion to and giving in to the world of its heedfulness, it assails Da-sein. Mood assails. It comes neither from without nor from within, but rises from being in the world itself as a mode of that being. But thus by negatively contrasting attunement with the reflective apprehension of the inner, we arrive at a positive insight into its character of disclosure. Mood has always already disclosed being in the world as a whole, and first makes possible directing oneself towards something. Being attuned is not initially related to something psychical. It is itself not an inner condition which then in some mysterious way reaches out and leaves its mark on things and person. In this, the second essential characteristic of attunement shows itself. It is a fundamental existential mode of the equiprimordial disclosedness of world, Da-sein with and existence, because this disclosure itself is essentially being in the world. Besides these two essential determinations of attunement just explicated, the disclosure of thrownness and the actual disclosure of the whole of being in the world, we must notice a third, which above all contributes to a more penetrating understanding of the worldliness of the world. We said earlier 3, that the world already disclosed lets inner-worldly things be encountered. This prior disclosedness of the world which belongs to being in is also constituted by attunement. Letting something be encountered is primarily circumspective, not just a sensation or staring out at something. Letting things be encountered in a circumspect, heedful way has, we can see this now more precisely in terms of attunement, the character of being affected or moved. But being affected by the unserviceable, resistant, and threatening character of things at hand is ontologically possible only because being in as such is existentially determined beforehand in such a way that what it encounters in the world can matter to it in this way. This mattering to it is grounded in attunement, and as attunement it has disclosed the world, for example, as something by which it can be threatened. Only something which is the attunement of fearing, or fearlessness, can discover things at hand in the surrounding world as being threatened. The moodedness of attunement constitutes existentially the openness to world of Da-sein. And only because the senses belong ontologically to a being, whose kind of being is an attuned being in the world, can they be touched, and have a sense for something so that what touches them shows itself in an affect. Something like an affect would never come about under the strongest pressure and resistance. Resistance would be essentially undiscovered, if attuned being in the world were not already related to having things in the world matter to it in a way prefigured by moods. In attunement lies existentially a disclosive submission to world out of which things that matter to us can be encountered. Indeed, we must ontologically in principle leave the primary discovery of the world to mere mood. Pure beholding reigns Anchuan, even if it penetrated into the innermost core of the being of something objectively present, would never be able to discover anything like what is threatened. The fact that everyday circumspection goes wrong on account of attunement, which is primarily disclosive and is vastly subject to deception, is gauged by the idea of an absolute world, cognition. But such ontologically unjustified value judgments completely fail to recognize the existential positivity of the capacity for being deceived. When we see the world in an unsteady and wavering way in accordance with our moods, what is at hand shows itself in its specific worldliness, which is never the same on any given day. Theoretical looking at the world has already flattened it down to the uniformity of what is merely present. Although, of course, a new abundance of what can be discovered in pure determination lies within that uniformity. But the purist does not abandon all moods either. Even when we look theoretically at what is merely present, it does not show itself in its pure outward appearance unless this Yupfa lets it come toward us in a tranquil lingering. In PC 6 Tilval, and we must not confuse demonstrating the existential ontological constitution of cognitive determination in the attunement of being in the world with the attempt to surrender science ontically to feeling. The various modes of attunement, and their interconnected foundations, cannot be interpreted within the problematic of this investigation. As phenomena, they have long been familiar ontically under the terms of affects and feelings, and have always been considered in philosophy. It is not a matter of chance that the first traditional and systematically developed interpretation of affects is not treated in the scope of psychology. Aristotle investigated the ikkial in the second book of his Rhetoric. Contrary to the traditional orientation of the concept of rhetoric, according to which it is some kind of discipline, Aristotle's rhetoric must be understood as the first systematic hermeneutic of the everydayness of being with one another. Publicness as the kind of being of the they cf. Section 27 not only has its attunedness, it needs mood and makes it for itself. The speaker speaks to it and from out of it. He needs an understanding of the possibilities of mood in order to arouse and direct it in the right way. The continuation of the interpretation of the affects in the Stoics, as well as their tradition in patristic and scholastic theology down to modern times, are well known. What has not been noted is the fact that the fundamental ontological interpretation of affects has hardly been able to take one step worthy of mention since Aristotle. On the contrary, the affects and feelings fall thematically under the psychic phenomena, functioning as a third class of these, mostly along with representational thinking and willing. They sink to the level of accompanying phenomena. It is the merit of phenomenological investigation that it has again created a freer view of these phenomena. Not only that, Scheller, adopting the suggestions of Augustine and Pascal, steered the problematic toward the connections between the foundations of representing and interested acts. Of course, here too, the existential ontological foundations of the phenomenon of act remain in the dark. Attunement discloses Da-sein not only in its thrownness and dependence on the world already disclosed with its being. It is itself the existential kind of being in which it is continually surrendered to the world, and lets itself be concerned by it in such a way that it, in a certain sense, evades its very self. The existential constitution of this evasion becomes clear in the phenomenon of entanglement. Attunement is an existential, fundamental way in which Da-sein is its there. It not only characterizes Da-sein ontologically, but is at the same time of fundamental methodical significance for the existential analytic because of its disclosure. Like every ontological interpretation in general, the analytic can only listen in, so to speak, on beings already previously disclosed with regard to their being. And it will keep to the eminent disclosive possibilities of Da-sein of the widest scope in order to gain from them information about this being. The phenomenological interpretation must give to Da-sein itself the possibility of primordial disclosure and let it, so to speak, interpret itself. It goes along with this disclosure only in order to raise the phenomenal content of disclosure existentially to a conceptual level. With regard to the later interpretation of such an existential ontologically significant basic attunement of Da-sein, anxiety, cf. Section 40, the phenomenon of attunement will be demonstrated more concretely in the definite mode of fear.